Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is André Asplund, a Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership postdoctoral associate in East Asian Studies at the MacMillan Center. Professor Asplund specializes in Japanese foreign policy and diplomacy in East and Southeast Asia. He is particularly interested in how Japan's normative ambitions of spreading human rights and democracy fits within its international relations with non-democratic and strategic partners in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Today we'll talk with Professor Asplund about his forthcoming paper entitled Normative Power Japan, Settling for Chinese Democracy. Welcome, Professor Asplund.
Thank you.
Let's start with an overview of your paper. Tell us about it.
So in this paper, I draw on the developments in Japanese foreign policy right now with the new Shinzo Abe government sort of staking out a new direction for Japanese foreign policies where more proactive contribution to peace and security, specifically in the Asia-Pacific region, and how Japan now seeks to utilize its foreign aid program, foreign aid that has been a huge part of Japanese foreign policy, in a more strategic way to contribute more to Japanese national interests.
Okay.
And in this paper, I'm interested in understanding how such foreign aid has been facilitating any normative power of Japan, the way Japan could disseminate norms to other countries in the region. And I look specifically on first the rule of law in the South China Sea, and how Japan is sort of setting that as the normal legitimate behavior in that region. And I want to understand if this normative power is then applicable to more non-security related realms of Japanese foreign policy, such as human rights and democracy.
Okay. And what led you to write the paper? What was the catalyst?
So I was writing another chapter on the EU and Japan in the sort of era of the rise of China and potential modes of cooperation. And I was intrigued by the European Union sort of not being able to extend its normative power to other areas outside of its sort of geographical confines of the European continent, in its foreign aid, foreign trade relationships with, for instance, Vietnam and Myanmar. And so that intrigued me to look into Japan, which is a major player in this region in terms of foreign aid, to see if Japan is able to have a political impact on these countries through these venues of providing foreign aid.
Okay, and tell us about your methodology. What did you look at?
So the analytical model that I wanted to employ for this is sort of a simplified model where so in terms of sort of measuring normative power being the ability of an actor to set what goes for normal in international affairs, its ability to present its own worldview as compatible with that of the communal aim in target states.
And just give us some examples of what normative values would be.
So the values that I'm looking at now would be, so the rule of law at sea in the South China Sea, human rights, democratization, those values and norms. And so the methodology was I looked at joint policy speeches where Japan meets a target state, a head of state, and in these venues every year they convey hopes and wishes for the future, problems that they are encountering, and how they want to solve those. And I'm trying to trace if we can see Japan framing these values and issues as something that they see as important for the target state to also comply with. And I sort of trace that through the years in these dialogues to see if we then can have if we find a reciprocation or a sort of joint communique where both parties agree to this and say that this is something that we also strive for. And then I take that analytical model and I try to place that on human rights and democracy.
Okay. Japan has a history of isolationism and really showing little interest on the world stage in terms of playing an active role in global affairs. Do you think that is changing based on what you're seeing?
I think this is something that has been ongoing for a long time in small incremental steps.
Okay.
It's an inevitable change that Japan has had to take on by socializing more into the international community. I think it's been highlighted since the now from 2012 and on, the Abe government has highlighted that even more, pushing this narrative that Japan is in fact not a normal country, it's an abnormal country. It's a pacifist, but a passive pacifist country, and it needs to become an actively pacifist country, an actively pacifist country that can, for instance, sell arms to other countries in order to secure democracy. That's sort of the narrative that is being pushed more and more by the growing political right in Japan, as opposed to the political or the sort of diminishing political left that is actually pushing for this pacifism as something uniquely positive for Japan, not something that is abnormal in that sense. And all of this, I think, needs to be seen against the backdrop of the rise of China, the so-called rise of China, and particularly the perception in Japan and in the US, for instance, and elsewhere, of a China that is increasingly assertive, increasingly aggressive, and it's sort of bent on expansionism, even hegemony.
Okay. And that is something that Japan feels it needs to address. Is
Definitely,
that correct? Yes.
And specifically the political right sees that the only way for Japan to be able to answer to this so-called or this perceived threat of the rise of China is to amend the constitution, the so-called peace constitution in Article 9, where Japan renounces waging war as a means to settle an international dispute. But because of public opinion in Japan being against a revision of the constitution, you can see these other small steps that Abe has been taking.
For instance,
setting up the National Security Council in 2013, the new National Security Strategy, the new Development Cooperation Charter, in which this proactive contribution to peace and security is stipulated over and over again, and where this proactive contribution to peace and security is being linked to a more strategic utilization of foreign aid.
Okay, and let's talk about that utilization of foreign aid. How is it changing and why?
So, in my opinion, I don't think that the actual practice of providing foreign aid is changing that much.
Okay.
I think that the policies are changing and becoming more, quote-unquote, honest. They're becoming more aligned with the actual practice that has been ongoing for decades in Japan. Japanese foreign aid has always been very much a national interest, a serving national interest, for which Japan has been heavily criticized by the OECD, the Western traditional donors, saying that Japan should not provide concessional loans, it should rather provide grant aid to countries. It should not build economic infrastructure, hard infrastructure. It should build social infrastructure. But Japan has sort of taken its own way and focused on win-win situations where both the provider of foreign aid and the recipient of foreign aid wins.
And is that working?
That has been working very well for Japan. I guess it's always a matter of development actually leading to economic development, development aid leading to economic development. I think the jury is still out on that, but it's been very successful for Japan in forging these very close relationships with Southeast Asian countries, which after World War II obviously was not a very friendly position towards Japan, Japan being sort of the aggressor in this area, occupying many of the Southeast Asian countries.
So it seems to be somewhat strategic that Japan is trying to foster friendships with these other countries, given the aggressive nature of China. Would that be true?
That is definitely the perception in Japan, that China is aggressive. But China, we also have to remember that China is the main competitor to Japan in building infrastructure in Southeast Asia and also in Africa. China now has, as a sort of an answer to the Asia Development Bank, China 2 years ago inaugurated the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is led by China, which is also a sort of competitor to the more Japanese-led Asia Development Bank, focusing on building infrastructure in this region. So China, it's both a sort of a threat strategically, but it's also a competitor economically. And for that, in that sense, concessional loans being the main modus of providing foreign aid for Japan, it's very much an economic competitor in that sense.
Okay. So what are some of your findings in your paper?
So in my paper, I make the case that Japan can indeed be called a sort of normative power in the sense of setting the rule of law at sea as the normal, legitimate behavior in the South China Sea. And for that, Japan has successfully been using its foreign aid in terms of providing vessels, patrol vessels for these littoral states, Vietnam, Philippines, for instance. But it's also been developing the capacity of coastal guards in Myanmar, or in Malaysia and in Vietnam and in the Philippines. And so by helping these states, helping Japan to make sure that these seas are ruled by laws and not might, Japan in that sense have been become a normative power.
How is China, though, factoring into that sea space as well?
So China in its own sense is a normative power. China is probably more described for what it's not than what it is. It's not the sort of hegemony of the European Union. It's not the neoliberal cosmopolitanism of the European Union. It's more of a do as I do. We do together. Look at me, I developed this way, you can do the same, as long as it doesn't clash with my development. And I think that's what we're seeing now in the South China Sea. We see a lot of countries that have followed the route of China, developing in China's way, and now that they're clashing. And this is also sort of what's then feeding the Japanese normative power, how Japan can use China as the significant other. China is different. Japan is democratic. Japan is rules abiding. Japan is, by that definition, legitimate in that sense. And look at China. China is the opposite. It's undemocratic. It's a human rights violator. It's not abiding by the rule of law. Hence, China is illegitimate. So, in that sense, that boosts Japan's normative power with the countries that are in disputes with China.
Okay, and what do you conclude?
So I think I conclude on a country level that Japan's foreign aid in terms of facilitating democratization and human rights adherence in countries that are not specifically democratic and not specifically interested in human rights.
Such as which ones?
Such as a number of ASEAN countries, for instance Laos, for instance Vietnam, for instance Myanmar. Japanese aid geared specifically towards human rights and democracy in that sense will only be as effective, or it will only be as used to the extent that it is actually a leverage against Chinese competition. As soon as those two things clash, that will not be effective. But on a more regional level, in ASEAN level, Japan, by ascribing already ASEAN as sharing these values with Japan, as Prime Minister Abe has been doing, saying ASEAN is democratic, it's human rights sharing, and so on. In effect, what that is doing, it's legitimizing a sort of Chinese democracy. It legitimizes, or it allows China to set the threshold for what these countries need to fulfill in order to be recognized as democracies by Japan. So effectively saying that some of these countries not being that democratic, you can be part of this in-group, this democratic, universal values believing group by only committing to a level of democracy on par with China.
Mm-hmm. Moving forward, do you think Japan should be doing perhaps something different in terms of its foreign aid?
I think what we're seeing right now in the aid community is the OECD DAC, the Western traditional donors, are realizing that they are becoming obsolete. Their way, the traditional way of providing aid, is not competitive anymore. The emergence of China as a huge aid donor, taking up on the old way that Japan used to provide aid, is now getting Japan to also looking back at how it used to provide aid, more win-win, more self-interest. And that in turn is getting the Western world to see, okay, this is what we need to do if we want to stay competitive in the foreign aid business, because that's what it is, it's a business. Mm-hmm. We need to start think about this more in terms of win-win. Mm-hmm. And hence the term foreign aid is sort of diminishing and is increasingly becoming development cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and what are your next steps in terms of your research? I know you're here as a visiting scholar. Mm-hmm. What have you been working on while you're here, and where are you planning on going next?
So my first project was on this European Union and Japan cooperation in the era of the rise of China. What I want to do in the future now is I'm going to investigate more these sort of venues that I think are being facilitated by Japanese foreign aid in these countries that mm-hmm. are less than democratic, and see if these venues, if the actual fact that Japan has not been conditioning its foreign aid with political requirements, if that can open up a venue of trust and recognition that in the future might be fruitful for normative power, or a way to sort of leverage against China.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Thank you for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you so much.
For more information about Professor Asplund and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.